Welcome again to Permaculture and Sociocracy, Stories from the Field. This is about on-the-ground experiences and stories about applying sociocracy to permaculture organizations. And we are going to hear from special guest speakers, Henny Freitas and Julian Howell. So we believe that permaculture and sociocracy share many values and make very good partners, natural partners. However, there are many permaculture organizations and communities that have been in practice for a while and maybe approaching sociocracy as a governance approach for the first time. So what is that like for them? What are the challenges and the wins, and what are some tips to help them get started and to move forward? So our two special guest speakers have been doing this for a while. They've been in the trenches and seeing what it's like to get this going, to get permaculture organizations to adopt and to learn and use sociocracy. Many people here in this event attending have experience with permaculture, but for those of you who don't, briefly, it's a system for both agricultural and social design principles that are sustainable and that utilize the patterns and features in natural systems. Sociocracy applies these practices. Consent, policy made with consent of people who are affected. We use no objections, as opposed to I agree, to make forward action likely. Circles, groups, which are groups of people, have our focus, an area of focus, and they have autonomy and elect their own officials. Double linking is 360-degree representation, and equivalency. All voices are equal. So our special speakers, I'm going to just tell you one or two things here about them. They will elaborate on that more when they speak next. Henny Freitas is with Casa Latina, Council of Latin American Sustainable Settlements and New Parks Network in Brazil. And she's done a lot of research and training in both areas. Julian Howell is with the Brighton Permaculture Trust in Brighton, UK, and he is also in co-housing. So, and then we have our speaker, our moderator, Daniel King. He's an academic based in the UK, and his research is in more democratic ways of organizing. So I'm going to be handing it over now to Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much, Millicent. So what we're going to start off with then is to talk to our two guest speakers for the day, who will then be introducing themselves, and we'll move into a further discussion. So I'd just like to start by inviting Julian to maybe say a little bit more about himself, and then a bit about basically how we got into the world of permaculture and sociocracy.
Thank you, Daniel. Just a quick correction. I'm not actually in co-housing yet. I'm in an aspiring co-housing group. I'll talk more about that later. I was interested in environmental issues from about the time I left university back in the 70s. I did some work for Friends of the Earth in Birmingham. I got involved with C&D. And then I went off and became a graphic designer. And I came back to permaculture through a friend who was doing it in the late 90s, and got slowly drawn in, really, partly through friendship and partly through a growing awareness that I needed to have more connection with the earth, and a more, I needed to go back to the environmental interests that I'd heard earlier on and apply it a bit more. So I've got involved with Brighton Permaculture Trust, which is quite a successful local group in the UK. At first I worked mainly as a graphic designer, and then I joined the management team. And actually just stepped down from that on a sort of temporary basis because my other work has taken over. which is my other strand of sociocratic work, is largely through co-housing at the moment. We set up a co-housing group a few years ago, Sussex Co-housing, which adopted sociocracy after a few years of groups sort of developing and collapsing, and we felt the need to constrain the group and have a much clearer form of governance. And this was partly informed by the local transition in Brighton, which started off very excitedly. Transition is a permaculture solution to the threat that was seen of peak oil. But this group didn't work very well. It collapsed, and suddenly it seemed really important to look at governance. And I've always felt that permaculture is not just about growing things. It's about design that can be applied to any aspect of life. I'm not a natural gardener. That's not my experience, not my strength. I'm more interested in community and environmental sustainability. So is that enough for now, Daniel? Or
Yeah. Get into some of the details of that as we go through. I'm just going to introduce Henny as well, and then she's got, so if you just bear me a moment, I'm setting up some slides that she wanted us to be able to.
Yeah, I'm a visual person, so I think it helps to get to know me a little bit more, and so I can be just in the little box down the screen. So I'm here to share a little bit my experience about the Council of Sustainable Settlements of Latin America, which stands for CASA, and CASA in both Spanish and Portuguese means home in English. So go on, Danielle. In order for me to find out what this home meant to me, I came to a formula that I divided between I, we, and together. And I mixed that with permaculture as well. I being, how do I care about Earth? You know, the main principles of permaculture. How do I care about Earth? How we together care about we people and about the Earth. And how together we share our knowledge, our tools, our resources, and return the surplus of both us, you know, the I and the we, meaning the Earth and the people. So I understood, go on, Daniel, thank you. I understood that for me to be able to do that, I had to leave my comfort zone and apply the zone zero, which is within me. Before even looking at how to design a landscape, I had to design my own self. So that's me leaving my home and leaving my comfort zone to be able to embrace this world of sustainable living that was around me, okay? So knowing that it would all depend on myself first, I co-created a project called the Earth Code Project. And we questioned where would we go as society and how would we do to get there, living a sustainable life, okay? So then I designed a pattern. I designed a model in how I would investigate and address those intentional communities that I was coming across. And the first community I went to visit was an indigenous community here in São Paulo, one of the biggest metropolis of the Americas with about 13 million people. So I say that I live in a very tiny community of 13 million people. And it's so tiny that there are like about 3 indigenous tribes. And I went to one of them. And like I learned the most beautiful pattern that I take to my life up to now. And the cacique, the chief of this tribe, he told me that culture is what we cultivate. And so I asked myself, like, what the society is cultivating in their own lives. So I added, as I was doing economics, I was analyzing the triple bottom line, which includes the social, economic, and environmental aspects. And I've added what other economists were studying at the time, sorry, which were the ethic and the spiritual aspects, okay? I'm gonna leave the, okay, Daniel? I'm gonna leave the presentation with you guys, but just to see what I found the conclusion of these lives. In the social aspect, like most communities were seeking to improve their quality of life. Okay. Okay.
Oh.
In the ethical aspect, they were looking for a common unit approach. So they considered, for example, eating vegetarian food as part of this ethical approach. Okay. I can, yeah. In the environmental aspect, you know, they didn't go and look and decided to move to this natural place where everything was already nature, and everything was, you know, nature had designed it all. No, they were looking for lands in which they could regenerate it and don't generate waste while designing their own landscapes. Okay. And in the spiritual aspect, they understood that self-realization would come through the power of mind. Instead of belonging to a specific religious, they could change their reality around them by communing with the people that they were living with. And I think there's one more. Just a second. We just jumped the economy aspect, which most of them prefer to keep the economy local. And then we're going to be able to talk a little bit more about, like, if we came to this formula, that's the last slide, the sustainable systems slide. If we came to a perfect formula where, you know, we know that communities want to live together, they apply permaculture in their lifestyles, they want to make decisions together, they want to live this alternative life together. Why that's not a reality yet? And I leave this part with a sentence of Bill Mollison that really inspired me to look beyond permaculture and to find something else that could be also a partner, also a culture that would integrate both permaculture and sociocracy within community living. And he says that the tragic reality is that very few sustainable systems are designed or applied by those who hold power. And the reason for that's obvious and simple. To let people arrange their own food, energy, and shelter is to lose economic and political control over them. So he advised us to cease to look power structures or hierarchical systems or even governments to help us, and devise ways to help ourselves. I think I will stop now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So that gives us sort of a bit of an overview of both of our speakers, and they've both got a range of different organisations that they're involved in. So as I say, please feel free to use the chat facility to raise questions and comments as we go through this discussion as well. But just go back to Julian first of all then. So just tell us a bit more into the Brighton Permaculture Trust. Just what is that organisation? What do you try to achieve? And then tell us a little bit about how you tried to bring sociocracy to them. You're muted. Thank you.
Brighton Permaculture Trust has been going for a lot of years, at least 20 or 25, I think. And it's been involved with a broad range of issues. It is largely about growing things. It has a lot of strength in orchards, and it has a lot of strength in education. It also has strong connections with sustainable building. Each year we run a Green Architecture Day, which is a day of talks by experts in sustainable architecture. And it's also been involved in an event that was called Eco Open Houses, that's run for a few years, where people who've done environmental improvements to their house open to their houses to the public over a few weekends. And both of those have been quite successful. Brighton Permaculture Trust also runs an annual Apple Day in a local park, which has just been growing and growing. It's really successful. And it's gradually taken on orchards, which is managing. It's got a scrumping project where it gathers fruit from fruit trees that aren't being harvested properly. It's developing products from those, apple juice, pear juice, which sells extremely well, and a range of chutneys and jams and things like that. My role in that was mostly designing labels, but everybody has a role in that sort of thing.
Okay. And why then sociocracy as a form of organising?
I've been involved with Brighton Permaculture Trust for a few years, and I was just starting to get involved with the management team when I was introduced to sociocracy. I came to that through partly through the transition movement, and partly through the failure of a transition group in Brighton to take off, because it didn't have a good enough governance structure. So I got interested in governance structures, and I learned initially about formal consensus, which is a structured way of reaching consensus decisions, which works very well, I think. But that sort of evolved into an interest in sociocracy, which is a broader form of governance for organizations. It goes beyond just the decision making into how an organization holds together. And it struck me and others in Brighton Permaculture Trust that there was a strong overlap between how sociocracy is organised and how Brighton Permaculture Trust was organised. Brighton Permaculture Trust was organised with a central management team and what we called petals, which were areas of activity like running the courses, working in schools, the fruit products, and so on. And because Brighton Permaculture Trust was doing quite well and expanding, we thought, how can we manage an expansion from this slightly cosy little group? We talked, we had a visioning day. In fact, there was a couple of visioning days where we talked about various possibilities. And I gave an introduction to sociocracy at one of these, and we developed the expanded vision of Brighton Permaculture Trust as a sociocratic organisation. I was quite fresh to sociocracy at the time, and I was talking about it in terms of a top circle and then a management team and then activity circles. And there was a lot of resistance in Brighton Permaculture Trust to having a top circle above everybody else, that hierarchy. I was arguing that hierarchy happens, that you need to accept it and organise it rather than just let it happen. But somebody came up with a brilliant idea of turning the diagram upside down. So the trustees, the directors were at the bottom, and they fed the management team with their contacts in the community, their suppliers, their company's house, the tax people. They had all those kind of formal roots with the community, holding the management team, who then grew branches out, creating circles of activity like leaves and flowers on the tree. And it's just an image that worked really well. People found it much more acceptable.
And when people were talking about hierarchy and things, why was that a problem for that? Something about permaculture that meant that people were questioning those sorts of ways of organising?
I'm not aware of anything particularly in permaculture that would work against some kind of necessary hierarchy. But I think quite a lot of people who like sociocracy, like permaculture, also dislike top-down organisations. They're into cooperation and egalitarianism. I've just come fresh from this experience of Brighton Transition collapsing, by being too unstructured, too open, that it couldn't make decisions, it couldn't go forward. So I and others were arguing for some sort of structure, but I think what made sociocracy appealing was that the hierarchy is not people telling others what to do. It's feeding policy, cascading policy in one direction and cascading feedback in the other, in a feedback circle, which is one of the really common principles of both permaculture and sociocracy. I mean, it's nothing unique to them. It's common in graphic design, which I learnt, and engineering and all sorts, but it's not always talked about quite so openly and used so deliberately, I think, in community organizations. But community organizations are gradually getting more sophisticated.
Oh, interesting, thanks. We'll come back to you in a minute. So, Henny, then, just tell us a little bit more again, sensitive question about about your organisation and why sociocracy was a path you wanted to take as a way of organising.
Okay, can you go to slide number 12, please? So when I was trying to figure it out what, that aha moment that I read of Bill Mollison's word, we're saying why we don't have these systems that are more horizontal and share more things. Just keeping this slide in the transparency one. So it was when this click of sociocracy came to me as well, while doing while continuing investigating the sustainable living within communities and also practicing permaculture in the field. And I think that really clicks on me, why we are not prepared, why we're still questioning the way that we use our power. Because if we take the etymology of the word sociocracy, we still have the cracy, which means power. It's just that it's a power distributed amongst its socios, its community. So it's a power run by the community itself. And one thing that really made sense to me at that time was the transparency, because people are not willing to know the truth. They might know, but they might ignore because it's very easy to be believing in what people are saying. So the transparency, which is one of the principles of sociocracy, really came to me at that time. And then the second principle of the sociocracy is the equivalence. And most of groups that I was part at that time, they said, well, we want equal opportunities to everyone. And if we look at the picture number 1, we're gonna realize that this is being equal. This is to share our produce, or to share our knowledge, or whatever we share it equally. So it doesn't really make sense in this example. But if you look at the third picture, which is what we in Brazil are facing at the moment, our government being very, taking power, not listen to the people. We want we want the president out, and we are, looking for ways in order to do it. But it's just power over power over power that doesn't let us express ourselves, that doesn't let us participate in the process of our society. And when we talk about permaculture, as Julian mentioned, it's not just gardening. Permaculture is also, how we live together. Just rephrasing that indigenous chief again, is what we cultivate. So the third aspect of this picture is the center one that says social justice. And this is what equivalence is all about. It's not distributing power amongst us all the same way. It's to realize what we need in order to be in the same level, to be with the same power to do our work and do it well. So if we move along, this is what I realized, that it doesn't say that, but it uses the word Ubuntu, which is an African language, an African word that says, I am because you are. So in this point, it's like they should, you know, like what you and I can do together. And instead of just doing bits and things, you know, having mine and your organization and trying to work things out separately, it's the challenge to put these all organizations together. And then go on. It's when CASA got to me. We were participating on a conference back in 2012 that is called El Llamado de la Montaña, the call of the mountain. And we applied a methodology called Visuals Council, in where we didn't know by then, but we were doing sociocracy already, because we were dividing ourselves into circles. So we have, for example, the circle of economy, the circle of ecology, and the circle of sustainable settlements. So within this circle, what came out of all that collective intelligence was the birth of CASA, the birth of the Council of Sustainable Settlements of Latin America. And that was in 2012. And we heard about sociocracy by then. And we were really catched by it, but we didn't know what to do with this methodology yet. We were still taking our decisions on consensus basis, and we thought that that was good enough for that time. But in 2015, we decided to do our first Latin American conference and to find out how our home was doing, you know, like in order to improve the way we were communicating and the way we were distributing power, the way we were organizing our living together. And it was when we decided to adopt sociocracy as our governance model. And if you look at the next slide, you're gonna see how it looks like today. We are still a living organism with living people within this system in a circular organizational structure. So we are basically a network of networks. So on the left side, and I don't know if it's left for you as well, I'm a bit dyslexic, we have what we call consejo, which means the council, the board. So we have like the different houses, different homes, different casas in this board. For instance,
we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. We'll come back to how you organise yourself in a minute. So I think what's quite interesting though for both of you then is that you're already working along the lines of sociocracy in one sense, but with some of the circles and some of the ways of organising, but didn't necessarily know it in that way. And they always had a background more in consensus-based decision making as well. So that both came across then. So yeah, so Julian, I just wonder about the trying to how you actually structured yourself. And you talked about having petals and this sort of, I quite like the sort of the flower metaphors that that you're using. And so when you began to try to work in a sociocratic way, how did you actually try to the mechanics of organising that? You're muted again.
I'm going to have to admit here that it's not been terribly successful implementing sociocracy. What we had was we firmed up the petals into teams. We had a session where we elected leaders for each team, but we've never properly got the double linking, which I think is important to sociocracy. We've never got that to work properly. The management team have been asking the groups to report on how they're doing and report any issues, but it's usually the representatives from the management team who are coming back with this information rather than anybody else in the teams. There hasn't been buy-in at all levels. So there's a willingness, but there hasn't been buy-in all round. There hasn't been sufficient training throughout the organisation.
So just going back one step then. So how were you trying to be structured? And then maybe we can go into why it didn't quite work then.
Well, Brighton Permaculture Trust had become a charity. So its top circle was its trustees. the general management team was made up of people working in different parts of the organization. And it included one or two trustees at each meeting. But although we had people in the management team who were effectively the team leaders of each sub-circle or activity circle, those activity circles never got together in a proper sociocratic sense. So it was working from the top circle down to the general management team, and it hadn't spread further than that properly.
So you were trying to work with the structures, but the people weren't fully engaging in how they're meant to be doing it.
I mean, I think the problem was this whole thing was really coming from me. As someone who, I've had a few years of working with sociocracy in a couple of organizations, but I didn't have the energy to really take it out there. I did one or two workshops to introduce people, and people liked the idea, but I do think it requires more than that to give it a chance to bed into an organization. And in some ways, people were like, they were withholding consent. They didn't want it. But I think we could talk to them more, and if we gave them some training, encouraged them, showed them the value of the kind of feedback that we're looking for, I think there's a chance that it could take off. But there's a lack of energy. We've got so few trainers in the UK, and I'm involved with 3 organisations who are using sociocracy or something like it, and so there's a limit to what I can do.
That's some interesting things there. I think, Henny, in your organisation, were you the one who were bringing sociocracy in, or were other people already part of that and had bought into some of the principles?
Repeat the question again, please.
This idea about buy-in and this idea about people being part of that then, so were you the one trying to bring sociocracy into how you were organising, or were there a number of you collectively sort of already had some training and some understanding and were trying to bring in that sort of approach?
That's a good question, because it all happens so natural that, you know, like when we say people want a power, so they want the power to come from down up and be built together. This is basically what happened to us, but without us realizing. So when I was saying that we were at this conference in Colombia, and we split ourselves in group, and we decided that, you know, like it was time for Casa to be born, we took that decision together. And we heard of sociocracy by then, but only 3 years later, we decided to adopt it because it started making really sense. And we were struggling to the way that we were making our decisions. So we said, okay, it's time to get to apply a governance that makes us being more autonomous with our decisions, and also makes us be more free with our time, and not lose that much time in meetings and etc. So it was when we got together, physically together again, because, you know, we are a network of networks and we are spreading different countries. So that would be like a negative aspect is in how to be together, basically, you know, like we have this barrier, this virtual barrier. So it was when we got together again as family that we said, okay, so we need to improve things. And we did a feedback process of, you know, what we've done in these 3 years and what could be improved. And one of the solutions was to apply sociocracy in the process. And when we did so, it was, like Julian said, it was a big challenge because, you know, like in any other methodology, you have like some steps to follow. And if you don't, you are disrespecting the model that you decided to apply. So at the beginning, it all looked a little bit bureaucratical, you know, like having to go through rounds of consent, having to go through rounds of impressions and follow that pattern. And then once again, in permaculture, you have patterns. So you observe and you realize that nature itself promotes a pattern. And when you bring that to social aspects, that's also a pattern that we are repeating. And the more we repeat, the more natural it becomes. So that's why we decided to apply sociocracy and to go through this, until the mechanism starts to work by itself.
So some of the language or the way of working of permaculture could tap into sociocracy, but maybe they're two different sets of languages and you need to translate them to connect. I mean, you've talked about the idea of petals or maybe patterns from nature and how they get replicated, and is it that maybe they're not immediately understood by permaculture, even though actually there's a lot of linkages between the two?
I think they are cousin languages. They're even born like in the same years, they're both from the 70s. I was not there to see it beginning, but they are almost 50 years old. So I think they are from the same time where people were questioning their ways of being, their ways of integrating with society, their ways of integrating even with nature, with all those post-wars happening, and like, what shall we do as a society? So I think they are very related. But yeah, language is one thing that, one experience I had bringing only permaculture this time to an indigenous group of people that, one of my projects is also to work with indigenous groups and to bring permaculture and to learn from their traditional ways as well. So we do this exchange. But language was an issue. When we talk about, even when we nominate it, even when we say, okay, let's do permaculture or let's do sociocracy, it brings such, like a square box of, here, this is the tool you're going to apply. But if we understand that we have a box of tools, and whenever we need to take an aspect of permaculture, an aspect of sociocracy, and we can work it together, that's brilliant. If not, let's not use it. Like, I think that this is, all these are tools, and we can use them in an appropriate time. I don't know if I answered your question. I'm a little bit dyslexic. Yeah.
So, I mean, Julian, I'd just throw the same sort of thing over to you then. I mean, we talked about maybe their cousin languages. They come from the same sort of background from the 70s. Just wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit more on any of that, or whether that connects to you, those ideas.
Yes, it does connect. I mean, there's a great deal of overlap. From pattern to detail is from policy to operations, for example. And in fact, an ex-colleague of mine, Nate Whitestone, did a nice translation of permaculture principles into sociocratic principles, which went through Holgram's 12 principles and showed how they could work in sociocracy. And it's a very, very close match. The SADIM and the lead, do, measure cycle, that sort of thing. So I think there's a great deal of overlap. They're natural bodies, and I think for us in Brighton Permaculture Trust, I think one of the issues has been the success of the existing culture. It's been working fairly well the way it worked. There wasn't an urgent need to change. It was a nice idea. I still think it's a nice idea. But it also depends very much on one or two individuals who are the people who work most in the organisation. They are ferrying information and policy backwards and forwards, rather than it being that sort of more inclusive method that there is with sociocracy. And maybe it needs for that to change in order to create the demand that would fire people up a bit more.
Yeah. See, Henny, you're nodding a lot to that. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the reality, like what you have to be ready for the people to get interested. If you try forcing sociocracy into a group that is already existing on their own way of dealing with things, it could be a little bit of a resistance from them. So it needs to be from the need, you know, like I brought today like 2 examples of an organization, to know which time you're going to show them, but it exemplifies like one group that really accepted the governance as a sociocracy, and we assume that we're a sociocracy organization, and the other group that does sociocracy but don't consider sociocracy as a governance model. But if you look at the, you know, at both structures, both organizational structure, they are quite similar. Even the double linking is similar, like just presenting in a different way. So it's like, if we, you know, like, I don't know, if you say, you know, we all need clothes and shoes and shelter to live in this society. But if you are forcing a person to buy that house in that particular place, or to wear those shoes, you know, it's just like, we all understand our needs, but they need to come to us naturally, you know, the first to adapt a different model in our society or in our organizations.
Yeah, I think what's interesting you're both saying is that whilst there's a real strong connection and they match and they overlap, if another way of working is working good enough, and probably people's attention maybe is on the permaculture and growing trees and wanting to do apple days, things like that, changing the way you organise is perhaps just a step too far for some people. Even though it might be better, there's still an investment in time and effort to get there as well. Julian?
Yeah, see, the Sussex co-housing that I'm involved with, it turned to sociocracy out of a need of the group sort of expanding and collapsing. And it just had to have a more definite structure in order to survive. We had people coming and going, and we were never able to make clear decisions or get down to deep policy. And since we've closed the core group, we've adopted sociocracy, and we've come a long way in terms of developing our principles, our ways of working together. We've got quite a good conflict resolution policy now, which I think is something that also goes hand in hand with sociocracy, really, or any of this sort of inclusive decision-making processes. And we're just starting to expand now, having task circles, as we call them. And there it's again a bit difficult to change your culture of having a team of, we had 6 people, we're now 10 people, and we've got 3 task circles. It takes a little while to get used to that, but people are very appreciative of how sociocracy works.
Sounds to me like you have a soil that's good enough and you're growing good enough plants. You could grow great plants, but there's quite a lot of investment in the soil and the land to make that work. We've got sort of 5 minutes or so. I need to open it up. I've seen on the chat there seems to be sort of some statements and some ideas there, not necessarily directly questions. I just wanted to throw it out to anybody who wanted to raise up a question or even make a point that hasn't been made in the chat. If anybody wanted to raise a hand, if anybody is on video who would like to ask a question or make a comment even. Experiences. Tony?
Yeah, I kind of had one question for each, Julian and Henny, and maybe I can give one and see if we can get to the next one after other people have talked. The one thing I was wondering, you maybe sort of answered it, saying there wasn't, that the permaculture group was functioning reasonably well. But I was wondering if there was something about the structure of sociocracy that was making it difficult for it to be implemented, or do you think there was some other factor that was unrelated to sociocracy?
My personal feeling is I don't see any sort of theoretical problem there. I think it is more of a cultural issue, in that I think a lot of people who get involved with permaculture are really into gardening, growing things and so on, and not necessarily always into meetings. So I think developing a sort of sociocratic way of dealing with that is perhaps something that needs to be thought about.
And Melissa, I believe you have a question. Anybody else got a question, by the way? Okay, Melissa, if you go next.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. So I have an experience from 2009 in being part of a large organization that adopted Agile in their development approach. And the transition, one thing that they did, I'm wondering if it might be helpful here, was to have a pilot group who got it going first. And that pilot group, you know, was like the equivalent of a circle, one circle, who did buy in. And then it did help build confidence and skill for the rest of the organization to see, okay, here's a group that's buying in, and this is what it looks like. And I just wonder for either Henny or Julian, if you've tried that or have any ideas about whether that would work or not work for helping the larger organization transition.
I can step in this time. With the New Parks Network example, there is one particular park that, you know, it's like an activism work here, that we are trying to save the last remaining green areas in São Paulo. And one particular park, that is the Parque Augusta. I remember the first meetings that I started going there, we were completely disorganized. Everybody wanted to talk at the same time. And everybody was against working in circles, because that wouldn't be the whole community. We would just have like few people here, few people there, few people, and everybody wanted to be together. That was lovely. So everybody holding hands, blah, blah, blah. But then we couldn't, you know, like we couldn't take our hands and bring everybody to one point, or bring everybody to another particularly issue that we had to work with. After 3 years, we realized that our assemblies working on consensus basis was not enough, was not good enough. We were very, you know, like every time that someone stepped in the process, we had to go back and explain the whole situation again. So when we decided to work with circles, you know, what we call GTs, groups of work, it's when we started smoothly going faster, because the situation needed us to go faster. And we then became more organized. And we are now in the process that things are running smoothly because we trust each other. So I think trust is one of the good factors that influence our decisions and our way of things. So we just decided to give a go, to, you know, to say, okay, let's just try it and see how it goes. And if it is not okay, we go back and be the same way we were before. But like this, you know, way of just encouraging ourselves to be a little bit more autonomous in our decisions allowed us to go further.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. We're pretty much up against time. So I'd like to thank both of our speakers. I think one of the lessons to me seems to be there's massive crossovers between permaculture and sociocracy, and its origins and its traditions and its ways of working, its values. The challenges we've talked about, it seems, are that then if people are interested in growing things and working on the land, but don't necessarily have the energy for meetings, then understanding the value of this and understanding actually how it can lead to the equivalence and the processes, and actually also be very effective way of organising, requires a bit of a shift and a bit of investment at first, which may have longer term benefits, but sometimes that can be a barrier to overcome. So I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today and for the chat and for the discussion. I'm going to hand you over back to Jennifer, who's going to sort of do a little bit of information about some stuff.
Thank you. I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Jennifer Howell. I'm operational leader of Sociocracy For All, which is a nonprofit based, headquartered in Western Massachusetts, but really we're all over the place, as you can see, because many of those people here took our class or are in our training program right now. I wrote in the chat, if you're comfortable, now is a good time to start your video so that we can get a sense of the group. And we also have a little tradition of after I've said my few things here, everybody unmuting and saying bye-bye to have a formal closing. So I'm going to share my screen in a second. While I'm doing that, I'm going to say something about implementation. What you guys have said and what some people have said in the chat is also what just starting in one group is typically a good idea, and then always it radiates out. If that group gets their flow going, that's the other thing. If flow is important for groups. So now I'm confused. I have two computers. Okay, but I think I'm doing, yes, I'm operating on the right one. So SOFA, Sociocracy For All, is a nonprofit. And we have 2 people on staff and a bunch of volunteers working with us. What we do is we make videos, most of all. Like, for instance, we also record our webinars. I want to show you a few videos, and most of all, for those who are new to Sociocracy, the one that is circled is the one to start with. And then I think you can see my cursor. This is the big webinar that we had a week ago, maybe? With about already, wow, sociocracy and permaculture, and then a bunch of other videos. So what we also do is we write articles, and we offer all kinds of resources, things to print out, meeting structures, and so on. Well, all kinds of social media. We do training. And we do in-person workshops, of course, but also we offer a curriculum for people to learn sociocracy on their own, basically. You can look at that. The people that organized this webinar were part of the event circle of SALT, Sociocracy Leadership Training. And we always have 3 groups in like about 6 people each learning together on Zoom. So very similar to what we did today, just that it's of course more interactive. We do implementation, we help with implementations, and we have a membership organization. So people in circles, we of course ourselves run Sociocratically. People working together in circles and making all kinds of cool things happen. Around content, community building, helping sectors, and personal development. And that is me. I'm going to stop sharing this. Stop sharing. So, do I get the last word, Daniel? Yes, I'm taking over from here. So I guess it's my job to thank everybody. I'm going to start with Daniel. Daniel did an amazing job here holding it all together, with supported by Millicent, who was sort of in the background but did a lot leading up to this, as did the event circle of SALT 4. And of course, our 2 invited speakers, Henny and Julian, who've both been in our training programs and both have a background in permaculture. So that's why they were here today. Thank you all. This is everybody familiar with that? Thank you, yes. And I guess we're gonna do our formal closing, which means I'm gonna unmute everybody. I'm gonna tell you first what happens. I'm gonna unmute everybody. You can all wave and say bye-bye and thank you, or whatever you want to say. And that is also a good moment to then, if you have to leave, to leave. And the tradition is that we stay on, stop the recording, and just hang out, okay? So unmute all, and say bye-bye, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.